Good morning. My name's Sarah Williamson, and I'm the CEO of FCLT Global. Our mission is to rebalance capital markets to support a long-term sustainable economy. And we're a nonprofit supported by leading organizations and companies around the world that develops research and practical tools to drive long-term value creation for companies, for savers, and for communities. So thank you for joining us today for the second part in our series on investing in the sustainable transition, focused on how capital can help shape the path to a more sustainable future. We know the trajectory of climate change will depend greatly on the actions taken by the global business community in coming years. And a key component of reducing emissions will be the transition of carbon-intensive industries to a more sustainable business model. However, this transformation can be difficult for leaders facing short-term pressures, and investors will be critical partners in supporting a sustainable transition. One of the areas in need of this type of foundational transformation is the food and agriculture industry. As the world's population approaches 10 billion people later this century, two critical and seemingly opposed tensions face the agricultural system. On one hand, there's a clear need to significantly scale up food production to meet the demand of a growing global population. However, there's also a need to drastically rethink the way food is produced to support this demand in a sustainable way. Both investors in agriculture and producers of food have critical roles to play in this transition. So today's webinar will explore how key players across the investment value chain can work together to meet these long-term challenges. We'll explore innovation in food and agricultural production and investment opportunities for deploying capital to support delivery of these solutions at scale. We welcome questions from the audience, and we invite you to submit them by email to Bryn, BRYN.Costello, COSTELLO, at fcltglobal.org. So we're excited to welcome you to this important discussion, and we hope to address these challenges. So let me introduce our panelists. We're looking forward to their insights. So starting with Martin Davies, is the president and CEO of Westchester Group Investment Management, an investment specialist of Nuveen, and the largest manager of farmland assets globally, with over $8 billion of farmland assets under management across 2 million acres. Nick Halla was the first employee at Impossible Foods and has held numerous senior executive roles at the company, which makes meat, dairy, and fish from plants. The company's mission is to make the global food system truly sustainable by eliminating the need to make food from animals. Nick currently serves as Senior Vice President for International. Han Lichtenstein is the Chief Financial Officer of Syngenta Group, and he brings broad experience in capital markets to this role, which includes strategy and integration to support Syngenta's agriculture innovations, including products and technologies that enable the food chain to feed the world safely, sustainably, and with respect for the planet. Audrey Lucas, a senior partner at McKinsey & Company, serves a number of the world's leading retailers, consumer packaged goods, agriculture, industrial, and healthcare companies. She has broad experience helping companies grow by adapting their business and operating models to changing consumer expectations. And finally, John Vasky, head of Americas and head of agribusiness at Temasek, the Singapore-based investment organization with over $200 billion under assets under management. John has a long tenure in M&A and oversees Temasek's portfolios in North America, as well as a range of agribusinesses around the world. So with that, we're going to jump into our discussion. And we're going to focus on several themes drawn from FCLT Global's research on the importance of innovation and cross-value chain collaboration to drive long-term value creation. So several of our panelists are leading significant innovation in sustainable practices in this sector. So let's talk about innovation to start. Hen, can we start with you? Syngenta has committed over $2 billion over the next 5 years to innovation, targeting a step change in agriculture sustainability. Can you tell us a little about Syngenta and what you mean by step change, and how does that fit into the longer term growth strategy? How do you think about these long-term trade-offs?
So maybe, thank you, Sarah. Great being on this panel. Just a few words about the Syngenta Group, newly formed last year from the legacy Syngenta businesses, crop protection and seeds, together with Adama of patent global leader in crop protection, and a number of important businesses in China, including Sinofert for crop nutrition, the new modern agricultural platform that I'll discuss in a second, which is transforming agriculture in China, as well as China National Seeds and a number of other businesses. So altogether, $23 billion annual sales. We're the largest agricultural input provider, and we have the broadest array from seeds to crop protection, crop nutrition, and the services to farmers in China and in other locations around the world, with a lot of digital services being added in the last several years. So very advanced, significant investments in R&D and innovation. Maybe a couple of words on the development of the agricultural space in recent years, or in fact, if we look at it over the last 7 decades, the world is producing about 4 times more food and feed than we used to. And this is during this same time when we reduced the amounts of chemicals in the newest applications by around 90 to 95%, and we still are able to achieve much higher yield with way less resource put into the ground. In many respects, if we were not applying modern seed technology, modern crop protection, crop nutrition technologies, we would see yields dropping by about 60-70%. So there's no way to sustain the world as it is today without the activities that have happened. What's also clear is that in the future, we need to produce another 50% growth of food and feed with depleting resources. So that's not sustainable. So it's quite clear that with everything that has been done in the past, there is still tremendous amount that we will need to do in the coming years. And our main mission for the Syngenta Group is to transform agriculture for the benefit of farmers and also for the benefit of the planet. So that's the big picture. Now we're investing and plan to invest about $2 billion per year in innovation of technologies and including acquisitions of technologies. And so within a framework of 5 years, we invest about $10 billion in innovation. These 10 billion translate into a pipeline of about $25 billion of annual sales in all of the array of seeds and seed technology, crop nutrition, crop protection, and farm services. And we've committed within the overall spend of the group to spend $2 billion in the next 5 years for breakthrough innovation that is meant to specifically transform sustainability and work in a stronger way for the planet. Now, everything that we do, the pipeline that we have for the future is all gravitating towards a more sustainable future. But the 2 billion specifically are meant to do things like artesian corn that we've launched recently, which is corn varieties that are much more sustainable under drought conditions. And we're now targeting for the coming years strategic steps in biotechnology and hybrid wheat that we plan to launch. So basically creating crops, developing crops that are less susceptible to drought conditions, that require way less nutrients from the outside and way less crop protection products. So to be much more sustainable and nature friendly. We also intend to dramatically enhance our biological offering. So just like with biological medications, to be much more specific, so target specific rather than chemistry, which we take into our bodies. So the biological drugs are much more focused, much more specific, and much more effective. So also changing crop protection to become more and more driven by biology. And the last is, of course, digital agriculture and precision systems that we're spending much more resources on, and these are meant to reduce again the amount of inputs that we put in the field to reach good outcomes. Last but not least is, of course, the modern agricultural platform in China that we've launched 3 years ago, and we're ramping up now as we speak. And that's meant to take backward agricultural areas in China and do full feasibility study and transformation into cutting edge agricultural technologies of the 21st century. And we're seeing dramatic increase in yield, dramatic reduction in inputs. And we've managed within the last 3 years to grow this business from nothing to more than $700 million of sales, and growing very fast to more than 300 centers by the end of last year. So we're very excited that many of our investments are bearing fruit, connecting to the long-term nature. Obviously, each one of our traits or crop protection products or advanced crop nutrition, and of course the MAP network, takes a lot of investment and a lot of time, about 5 to 10 years to reach fruition. So we need people to stay with us, to trust the track record of execution that we're demonstrating, and basically be able to bring a better world, but it's only through a long-term focus and investment.
Right, thank you. And so you're really trying to take a big company and move it in a very interesting and fascinating way. Nick, you're in a different space at Impossible, where you have essentially pioneered a new product category. And a lot of our research demonstrates that new categories often come from long horizon innovation, really thinking, way out. How have you thought about this long-term investment in research, the development of the food technology versus, near-term revenue generating, and how do you build something like that with this long-term mindset?
Well, it starts with the challenge that was just highlighted too, is like we need to produce 50% more food for humans over the next coming decades. And we've already expanded the land surface and tried to push all the efficiencies, and the system that we use today doesn't work. So the way we looked at this is like, if we try to incrementally improve the food system, we're not even going to get close. And so we need to look at the fundamentals of the food system and try to find out where the opportunities are. When it turns out, our whole hypothesis was we can create products from plants that can outperform anything an animal can do. Better tasting, more nutritious, much more sustainable, and then more affordable as we scale. And it's all just based on the premise of efficiency. So if you look at an animal as a technology of taking plants and converting them into food, like a beef cow is about a 3% efficient technology. And so now we talk about all those inputs and all those resources that go into our food system. It's really because our food system is designed to produce feed for animals. Then we harvest the animals and consume the animal. If we go directly to the feed source, the plants, we could feed the world in a tiny fraction of the land and resources that we use today. And so I start there because then that comes to the technology. And for us to be able to drive that big of a change, we have to produce products that consumers prefer over what they get today. We can preach the sustainability benefits, we can preach health and nutrition benefits and everything else, but unless people prefer it based on taste and pleasure and experience, we're not going to get anywhere. And so for Impossible, we started the company about 10 years ago around the proposition that we're going to create the most delicious meat the world's ever had directly from plants. And that enabled us to think long-term from the start. The first 2 years, we didn't even work on products. We worked on technology. So we worked on understanding what actually makes meat, fish, and dairy foods taste so good. Why does a steak transform when you put it on the grill from soft and red to like firm and full of flavor? And all that chemistry happens as you cook. And as we understood that, then we can go to the plant-based world and find better ways to do that. And then about 2 years in, we decided we'd make the first platform on ground beef. Massive global industry, hugely environmentally impactful, very important for the industry. And then we now compete head on head. So just based on flavor and performance and taste and experience, we're head on head with beef from an animal. It's because we took a long-term technology approach from the start. And a lot of people are surprised that Impossible is 10 years old because we haven't been in the market that long. We spent more than 5 years before we launched our first product in one restaurant, only at lunch. And this is when we were producing out of a pilot facility just to start getting testing. And we had raised 4 rounds of financing, almost $200 million going into the research and development and commercialization platform. And it was based on that vision that this is a $1.5 trillion industry and growing, super inefficient. And we're going to create a system that can outperform it on every metric. And then since then, you're right that the tension between like short-term growth and long-term innovation is always going to be there. But for us, it was so core in our mission that we have to replace the entire system with a better system, that we are always have our eyes on the ball like 5-10 years down the road, not next week. And I think being a private company like we have been with great long-term investors, including Temasek is one of our very long-term investors that has been a great supporter. It enables us to focus on the future while driving the growth. And the other great thing is like our growth and the impact, because for us and the founding of the company, it's all about positive environmental impact to create a much more sustainable future for the world. But growth and impact come together because every time a consumer has Impossible, it's a direct impact and a direct reduction in the environmental footprint, of our food system. And so I think the company now, we're about 700 people. We have, well over 100 people in research and development and growing. We have the ground beef platform, we have ground pork platform, we have a lot more stuff coming up too. Because to look at what we use animals for food today, and it's massive. There's so many different categories, and because people are looking for differentiation, experience, and it depends on the day and the mood and what you want, and we have to produce that. And then the other great thing is we're not limited by what animals can do. We can create stuff that consumers like way better than anything an animal ever could do. We just know that animals are a good starting point because we know that people desire that type of experience.
That's fascinating. I hadn't even thought about categories that, things that animals can't do. So Audrey, let me turn to you. So we've heard from both Syngenta and Impossible Foods that they're making really interesting long-term investments in technologies and agricultural practices that take time. They can take time to scale. How do you see, looking broadly across the industry, the landscape for these technologies evolving over time, and where are the biggest areas of opportunities and hurdles?
Well, thank you, Sarah, very much for first of all inviting me to the panel, and second for this question. I agree, based on the challenge that we have as a society, it's important that we identify and scale these innovations much more rapidly. We don't have a decade in all cases, as Impossible has had, to really, fuel many of the innovations that Ken and Nick are talking about. What I think is pretty cool is that there are several factors that are really coming together now to enable that acceleration of innovation. I'd say first and foremost, companies are recognizing that their success and competitiveness is linked to helping solve society's problems. And they're seeing this for a few reasons, right? They're seeing that companies with a high level of purpose, like Syngenta and Impossible just laid out, really do outperform the market in terms of, both capital access and higher profitability in many instances. They're seeing that their employees and really the war for talent requires them to have a strong social and environmental commitment. And frankly, ESG, disclosures overall are getting more scrutiny and more commitment from investors. We're also seeing consumers, as again, Nick, kind of alluded to, consumers have a lot more willingness to engage with and pay for innovations in this space, and that's new and really exciting. But to unlock this potential, companies really need to align incentives. They need to align innovations around, where can they really maximize what we call the triple bottom line, the return on people, planet, and profit. And there are barriers. There are real barriers. If this were easy, we would have already done it. There's innovation risk. Something like 90-95%, depending upon how you measure it, of product innovations fail. So you have to be willing to continue to invest despite that. The economic returns of these investments may not always be as attractive as others. Often there's increased cost that's not always offset by demand. And there's supply chain challenges, especially in developing markets. There can be a lack of infrastructure, certainly in roads, ports, other transport that can limit development. Now, many of these barriers can be solved through institutional or even governmental funding. And that's a bit of why we're all here. But I think what we're trying to do is exactly what Syngenta and Impossible Foods have laid out. We're seeking to find technologies that really help us to achieve the bottom line. What I loved about, what you said, Nick, was that Impossible Foods really reframed the problem statement, right? I think many companies had gone after incrementally, trying to make plant or meat-based foods more nutritious, more sustainable, et cetera. And instead, you said, let's create a plant-based substitute that really meets the consumer taste preference, and let's, you know, transform our ability to help the planet as we do that. And I think we can learn from that in other sectors as well. Obviously, there's a ton of opportunity, and Syngenta is going after this along with many, many other companies to reduce emissions from agriculture. You know, you alluded to earlier, Sarah, I think the challenge here in that food systems contribute about 30% of the global emissions. And, you know, when we look at the cost curve, which we did in concert with some WEF research, we find that there are many technologies that are aligned with both, you know, improving grower profitability and helping the planet. But there are many technologies that don't. And so we're going to need help. We're going to need institutional investors with a longer term horizon. We're going to need, you know, a collaboration between public and private sector in order to go after those that do not.
Oh, thank you. That's a, yeah, that's a, it's interesting when technologies are really supportive of this idea of being more sustainable. And of course, you know, not all are, and sometimes we go the other way. So tilting the scales is important. So John, let me turn to you. Let's think about the investor side, which is, we know that this long-term approach to a more climate resilient and food and agriculture ecosystem requires collaboration. It requires real capital. So I know Temasek has identified opportunities for agri-food companies to innovate, and we heard from Nick that you're one of their investors. And so how do you think about evaluating companies through this type of transition, you know, this sort of long-term, short-term payout? And what do you think we need to see to really get enough capital supporting this sort of move to a more sustainable world?
Well, thank you for including us on today's panel, and I would just echo, you know, what the previous panelists have spoken to in terms of what the opportunity is. I mean, we at Temasek have had sustainability at the core of everything we do across all of our industry sectors and industry verticals. I happen to have responsibility, as you highlighted, for the agri-food side of it. We tend to, in the way we organize our practice, start with the inputs and the outputs and go all the way almost to the consumer table. So our consumer team works quite closely with the ag team in terms of identifying what some of these trends are. And we just did a trends refresh recently as an institution to reaffirm those things that we put capital against in the past years, where they've been successful and where we think post-COVID and in the new environment we're going to come out into, where should our capital be flowing as well. Sustainable living still sits at the core of that, right? And so I think from a visibility perspective, innovation, technology, those are going to be bedrocks of kind of where we want to lean in with our capital. We're not, you know, agri and the food supply chain, frankly, are one area where we have the ultimate flexibility in terms of how we deploy the capital. So, you know, we have both public investing capabilities as well as, you know, growth investing. Growth equity is predominantly what we're known for. Having said that, in the ag space, we've taken any number of different varieties of capital deployment. We've even taken a control position, which is not unprecedented for us, but, you know, given the importance of water usage, ag, all of the things we're talking about, we took a control position in a drip irrigation business because, again, it just checks the boxes on a lot of things that we think are going to be important in this supply chain and value chain going forward. And so, again, we do a fair bit more early stage. We know there's going to be technology and innovation risk in that. Not everything that we, you know, invest capital in is going to be as successful as impossible or some of the other things in our portfolio. But we just think this is, you know, an existential issue that we're trying to solve for. And our capital, given the form of it, can play a very significant role in that. So it's not as if we're only going to invest in companies that have an absolute threshold of ESG, you know, metrics. We want to help, you know, the incumbents transition to a more sustainable, you know, kind of platform and give them a little bit of support as that journey unfolds. And we just think it's a, you know, we put probably over $5 billion to work in this space in the last 5 years. So it's a huge area of, you know, fresh capital for us. But we also, you know, we at the end of the day are trying to do the right thing in terms of, you know, the eco-friendliness of all of this. And again, that's core to who we are. But we're also investors, right? And so we think there's just a significant upside that can be had here as we make this transition. And some of it's going to be people that we've known as familiar faces in the ag chain, and some of it's going to be, new players trying to come at it with a different solution, if you will. And we want to be there for each and every one of them. The only thing I'd comment, again, we don't necessarily think about the short-term versus long-term conundrum. I think what we have done and pivoted to a little bit in recent years is to go in earlier when we see an addressable market that has got huge potential. We see a strong management team, and we see good bones of a company that could, affect the kinds of transition and change that we're talking about. And we will go in earlier than we typically might in other parts of our business, but continue to provide capital at every round of financing and just growing in confidence, with those. And again, the neat part of my job is we can hold public securities as well. So we're not trying to exit in an IPO event or anything like that. We can help these companies transition through to the public markets as well.
Okay, and Martin, maybe you can tell us a little more about Westchester and how you think about, clearly as a long-term owner, how you expand output, lower the cost of production, but also think about the long-term sustainability. How do you, as the landowner, think about the various uses and the discussions that you've heard so far about how we actually improve the productivity to feed the planet, but do it sustainably?
Certainly, Sarah, thanks for the question, and great to be here with the other panelists. Just before I maybe make some comments on that, I just wanted to add a few points just to put the situation in context here. So the FAO say that for sustainable food systems, we need $350 billion of investment into the ag and food sector every year for the next 10 years. It's a pretty frightening number. If you look at the top 22 countries globally and the total of pension fund capital, there's $44 trillion worth of capital in those top 22 countries. So the retirement scheme capital clearly is something that needs to flow to the ag and food sector. What do we do in the Westchester business? We're part of the Nuveen investment management platform. We're owned by the TIA general account, so we're managing retirement benefits for 5 million participants the TIAA are providing retirement benefit for. And we also manage capital in the main part for pension fund investors and also some retail investors as well. So I run a platform which invests in farmland and timberland globally. We manage about 3 million acres, growing 45 different agricultural crops in 10 countries. So what is that global food challenge about? The formula is quite simple. Production equals consumption and waste. Many different parts of the equation here. Waste is something that we need to solve. 88 million tons of food waste generated annually in Europe. We need sustainable consumption. If we look at a calorific map of the world, a lot of countries in the Northern Hemisphere are consuming far more calories than they should be. Where do we operate with our business? We're land-based investing, so we're at the production end of things, and we're looking to make investments in high-quality farmland or timberland, which can generate investors a stable income over the long term. To the question of how do we think about long-term sustainability and short-term gain? Massive part of what we do is risk management. And I don't think there is actually a conflict between generating stable returns and what is important in long-term sustainability factors. And just let me just use an example to illustrate what I mean by that. We're a significant grower of almonds in California. So almond consumption globally is growing between 4 and 5% per annum. This is a very popular snacking, cooking ingredients, and so on. Water usage in California has come under huge focus. So we can invest in a sustainable way, which generates stable returns and reduces the risk associated with those investments. So good quality land plus investment in technology around water delivery, it delivers better returns, but more stable returns in the long term. You think about the power that's consumed in agriculture and almonds in particular. There's a lot of water used. So almonds use about 4 acre-feet of water, 12 megaliters per hectare, significant consumption of energy. We can invest in photovoltaic panels to reduce the carbon footprint of the energy that we're using to pump water. And that's an investment which immediately produces dividends, and it really reduces the risk and has a sustainable aspect to it in the long term. So if we're looking at what drives the value of land in the long term, which is a key thing that we're looking at, natural capital value is intrinsic to that value, and we have to protect that natural capital, and that means that we have to have a sustainable approach, not just in the long term, but in the short term as well. So it's very much a focus of our business, certainly something that's embedded in all the processes that we have. How do we think about where we fit into the sector? We're providing additional capital relative to just traditional debt. We're facilitating the separation of land ownership and operation of businesses. So there is generational transfer of wealth. There's consolidation in the sector everywhere. We increase liquidity. So institutional capital owning farmland provides opportunities to the sector generally. The last point I would make is that institutional capital always has a focus around environment, social factors, and sustainability. So those are just a few thoughts and comments there, Sarah.
Really helpful. That's really helpful. And I think that, one of the, to me at least, one of the fascinating things is this intersection between the capital and the growth. And so we're actually starting to get a number of questions from our audience. And of course, I have many more. So I'm going to kind of try to mix and match a little bit here and give you all some questions. So one that has come in, I'll combine a couple, is somebody said, I haven't heard the term yet, biodiversity or organic. No one has used those terms in this conversation so far. Hen, maybe I'll start with you. How do you think about biodiversity and organic, I think, and then maybe Martin, I'll come back to you because you just talked about a number of different crops. So maybe I'll ask each of you to respond to those, and then I'll got some other ones that are coming in as well as my list. So Hen, can I start with you on that?
Sure. So we are basically the concept that we are using to demonstrate. I mean, obviously, we have on our operations, we try to reduce the carbon footprint, but that's common to all businesses today in the modern world. The real aspiration, which is at the core of our strategy, is to move to transform agriculture to be more nature friendly and more kind of climate friendly. So the notion that we tend to use is regenerative agriculture, and that's really what we're trying to work around, because you don't want to have concepts that reduce the yield, because this will require more resources. So you need to maximize or to optimize between yield and quality of the produce, alongside with taking care of the planet. So biodiversity is a fundamental building block of our regenerative agriculture concept. So it's well crafted in all of our concepts. We've worked with the Nature Conservancy to develop, when we say that we're going to invest these $2 billion to create step change breakthroughs in sustainability. We've designed the metrics together with the Nature Conservancy so that we can actually demonstrate to ourselves that we're actually going in the right direction. The only term that I don't resonate that much with is organic, because that's a term which is often used to it's not a scientific term. It's basically saying that we choose to use different systems or different methodologies rather than other methodologies that are totally scientific or even much more scientifically proven to be nature friendly and climate friendly. together with agriculture. So that, because that's a concept that says that everything which is not coming from nature is not good, and things that come from nature are good. And sometimes things that come from nature, like oil and gas, when you burn them, it's not good. So it's a lot of times it's you use non-scientific concepts, and you can go totally in the wrong direction. So I hope I responded enough to the question.
Yeah, no, that's great. And Martin, maybe I'll just ask you, and then or Nick, were you raising your hand? Did you want to
Yeah,
add?
I have one.
Do you want to add
one-
something to that, Nick? Sure, go ahead.
one
Please,
quick
let's
comment on that.
go right
Yeah. I think, I want to make a comment on the biodiversity side. If you look at wild species on Earth, and I think the statistics I've seen in the last 40, 50 years, they've been decreased by 60%. And that's driven mostly by our consumption of animal products and the expansion of land use to be able to grow crops to feed animals or for grazing for animals. And if you look at the issue or the challenge and the driver of that is animals are just very inefficient. And so when we think about biodiversity at Impossible, it's all about transitioning to a plant-based ecosystem, because we can put a lot of those native ecosystems back into an ecosystem versus using them all for cropland and a lot of marginal land that we really shouldn't be using for cropland. The biggest driver we can to increase the biodiversity on Earth and save the biodiversity on Earth is to stop expanding our land use. And the driver of the land use is almost all animal agriculture. And so when we think about this, it's all about transitioning our food system to direct human nutrition. And we can have a tiny fraction of the land use, which then enables us to have the biodiversity we want. And I think the other idea is, like, right now the food system is mostly developed to create feed for animals for us then to consume animals. Now, when you start thinking about now we can go directly to plant-based source, the sources, the breadth of biodiversity we can use as crops is very, very broad. And so the different crops we can use for human nutrition is really, really wide. As we learn essentially what drives the preference in taste and flavor, and as we take that pressure off the land expansion, just due to the inefficiencies. And so I think there's a lot of optimism for how we can bring a lot of the biodiversity back from what we're doing today.
Right. No, that's really helpful. And Martin, I was going to ask you about the other part of this, which is the monocrop versus the many crops. And you mentioned the number of crops. And so how do you think about, investing in single crops versus we're just responding with what Nick and had
Yeah,
said.
so the organic and biodiversity, I'm afraid to say I don't 100% agree with what Nick's view on animal-based systems. We don't actually invest in livestock. We invest in land that produces crops only, but I think it's a fairly complicated world, and I'm not sure entirely that those statements are necessarily true. Biodiversity, I think we get confused around biodiversity because people think about the biodiversity associated with the Cerrado, tropical rainforest, and climax vegetation. And there's no question whatsoever that as we've increased the footprint of land use for food production, there has been a loss of areas of biodiversity. But that 40% of the world's land surface is used for food production. So it's not just the biodiversity in the Amazon basin and other ecological systems globally, it's the biodiversity within the crop production system, because you're never going to feed 9.7 billion people by 2050 unless you do have what, let's call it sustainable intensification. You have to have the areas that you're cropping have to be farmed to produce efficiently. But what is that efficiency about? It's about doing more with less. It's about more precise usage of inputs. So Ken made the reference to regenerative agricultural systems. We all have a responsibility to reduce synthetic inputs in any agricultural production system, because it's good for the environment and it's good for the carbon footprint. So we need to use technology to enable us to do that. And what are we talking about in technology terms? There is technology today which actually on a crop sprayer identifies the different weeds that are in the field, and then only applies pesticide herbicide onto the weed. So we have to use technology to reduce synthetic inputs. That will in turn improve biodiversity in the in-crop area, and the loss of biodiversity isn't just through habitat loss, it's what's happened in the crop area itself. Organic farming, I'm sure Ken will love me for saying this, but I think sometimes the notion that we have around organic farming sends the wrong messages to people. So I have a garden, I grow vegetables in my garden, and I don't use any inputs at all, apart from horse manure, so fully organic. But how are organic potatoes produced? What is used to control blight, late blight in organic potatoes? Copper sulfate Bordeaux mixture is something which is typically used, and I would challenge anybody to find a more toxic, nasty product to be applying to crops. So not all things are what they appear superficially, and although I fully acknowledge the fact that there's an organic niche, organic consumption in the US last year increased by 14%, but it isn't a panacea. Organic farming isn't going to solve all the problems that we have. And I think that the type of technology that Ken was talking about, with more precise use of inputs and biological inputs, understanding, using technology to deliver those inputs more efficiently, is the way that the agricultural system has to go. And food waste, which I mentioned earlier, is a big part of the issue that we need to solve as well. And I'm not against organic farming. We've literally in the last 6 months made an investment in an organic almond orchard in California. I really like the characteristics that organic almond prices are not nearly as impacted as much as conventional almonds, given that we've been through a very big production cycle. But it's a niche, it has a relevance, but I don't think it's what we should be entirely focused on for all agricultural production.
Well, great. Well, John and Audrey, maybe I can turn to you. Audrey, were you going to say something on this?
I was just going to weigh in. I think
preferences,
one
yeah.
piece that we haven't really discussed around the word organic is just, how consumer forward, if you will, that term is, and the need really that this discussion has laid forth to create some consumer awareness, some consumer language around sustainable growing and frankly, traceability of where the product is being grown and developed under what practices, et cetera, to enable consumer choice, preference, and frankly, our collective ability to, sustain and grow innovations writ large that are benefiting society.
And Audrey, you were talking about changing preferences, and John, you mentioned that you had done some sort of refresh on preferences. I mean, part of this is this long-term anticipation of where the customer preference is going. John, can you tell us a little more about, what you've learned on that, or how, as an investor, you try to look forward and think about where are the trends going, and then put your capital behind some of those preference trends?
I think it touches on everything that's been said around these issues that are important to folks, again, from a sustainability perspective, and how can we feed, this growing population in an eco-friendly way. We probably picked it up from Impossible, just echo what Nick said. The cow is a horribly inefficient manufacturing plant, right? And I say that, having grown up on a farm in Iowa, so it pains me to say that at times. But, we also have other investments like Perfect Day. They're using, they're creating, dairy products, Modern Meadow, which is creating leather. I mean, there's all different types of applications. So we want to be part of, that process and that innovation and that, disruption, if you will, right? And these behavioral changes will take time. I mean, I think one of the other things that we're learning in the trends refresh work that we did, that there are regional, while the supply chain globally is interconnected, right? There are regional differences in terms of taste and protein consumption, things of that nature as well. So, we have, sort of an umbrella from a global perspective in terms of where we think consumer trends are growing. We're trying to get ahead of that in terms of what innovation could solve or satisfy those trends. But they have very different regional biases in terms of diets and growing affluence in a certain country and things of that nature. So, it's why we organize ourselves globally, so we can kind of figure out, where and how to capture those trends. It tends to be, a lot of earlier stage private situations, but again, we're quite open to, helping the incumbents, pivot their businesses towards these models, as well. But I think in some ways it's for me to listen in on this group is encouraging, because the capital deployment need is so acute, the opportunity set is so wide, that I think as an investor, this is going to be, you know, a very interesting and intriguing space for us for a very long time.
So let's take that investor perspective for a second. We've gotten one question about sustainability bonds. We've also talked earlier about the sort of the chain, if you will, from investing in just, you know, research in the lab, maybe even in an academic setting, to the serious amount of R&D that Nick and Impossible have done before going public, then the amount of innovation that is going on in the public space, and then the capital needed to move. So when we think about that sort of the ways that investor can invest in agriculture, and maybe Hannah, I'll come back to you. As you think about the ways that either an institutional investor or a retail investor can invest in agriculture, maybe you could give us some thoughts. And then Martin, I'll ask you as well about just sort of, you know, if you're listening to this and you've got a portfolio of more traditional stocks and bonds and you want to invest in agriculture in a long-term way, you know, what are some ways to go about that? So Hen, let me start with you.
Thank you, Sarah. So basically, when we think about investing in agriculture, it's not that straightforward. And as Martin can tell, I guess in his space there is more capital looking for assets than there are good assets, and it's not that straightforward to find the assets, to find a way to invest in a smart way and to run that over time. So and we've looked at that, and we resolved that, you know, there's expertise there that we're developing on the farm modernization side with MAP in China, but we're not that advanced in other places, so it takes time. I think that there are different opportunities to invest in the space of, if you take food and feed as together with agriculture, then there is way more opportunities, and John and Nick were alluding to some of the names. Obviously, Impossible is a fantastic name. With super innovative technologies that we're hoping over time to find a way with our seeds, with our advanced seeds, to adapt the traits, the crops that we can grow to the tastes and the quality needs of alternative foods as well. And I think that, you know, we're at the moment, the Syngenta Group is not public, but we hope to become public. So that could be, without obviously encouraging anybody to invest, that could be another way for people to at least have a go at the broad array of inputs into agriculture that we offer.
Right. And Martin, maybe I'll just ask you quickly, because this is a difficult asset class, particularly for institutions, let alone for individuals. You know, how would you suggest people get exposure to this, the changing food environment?
Thanks, Sarah. I think the first thing any investor needs to just understand what they're trying to do is what type of return characteristics are they looking for, what level of volatility are they willing to accept, and then to look at the agricultural value chain. As John said, the value chain is huge. If you go through from food and beverage manufacturers right down to what we invest in, land and everything in between, Syngenta's business, it's a huge value chain. But the characteristics of investing in let's say a food and beverage business are massively different to investing in farmland. If an investor is looking for a core, very low volatility investment, I would say that farmland or indeed timberland would be, and not to have correlation with the economic cycle, is a fantastic opportunity. If on the other hand, the investor is looking for a thematic, more private equity type investment, the other end of the value chain, upstream or even downstream, looking at the input side of things is the place to operate. But that does come with, it's thematic because of this doubling in food consumption that we've all talked about through the last hour. Yeah, but it's more of a private equity type investment, and much more volatility. many ways to access the value chain. There are plenty of listed companies to invest in, but I actually think that a very attractive way to approach the value chain is to either make fund investments or to make direct investments in companies that are operating within the value chain.
Hey, Sarah, can I make just one
Yeah,
comment
please do.
playing off of that? I mean, we've talked about the production and the consumption side. I think the one other aspect of the value chain is in terms of, grower practices, right? Like, how do we make the farmer a better return on investment business thinker, as opposed to just the generational ways that farming practices have been handed down? So that's just a comment to tack on. I think as it relates to the investable opportunities, I spent the latter part of my previous career consolidating or advising on the consolidation of the ag industry. I think some of what's going to come with these innovative, technology-oriented companies is a need for capital, the temptation to access the public markets either through a traditional way, or frankly, much has been written and said about SPACs. We clearly in our portfolio get approached by them all the time. Again, this isn't about that, but I also, if there was a cautionary note, it's, having capital that can help these companies on that continued journey, as opposed to the temptation to take in the capital when it's available to you and then needing to report progress on a quarterly basis, right? Which I think, given the seasonality and, a lot of disruption in technology is not a straight line upwards. It's going to require a little bit of patience on the part of public companies, because there's a strong desire to have exposure to these trends. I just hope some of the operators and the owners don't prematurely access that public pent-up demand for fear that, some of these don't go well because you missed a quarter or something of that nature.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. We've talked a little bit about public-private investment in these places. I guess in our few minutes left, maybe Audrey and Nick, I can come back to you with a slightly different angle, which is that developing investments. And I think both of you have referred to the global nature of this business and the changing food preferences in different parts. How do you think about this, either as an investor or as a company? Maybe Audrey, I'll start with you and let Nick end up in whether this is a northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere. How do you think about that combination in this global supply chain?
I think you're hitting it right on the head, Sarah. Right. I think, from a company landscape, we are advising companies who are constantly looking at their technology portfolio and marrying that up, as John described earlier, with where consumer and customer preferences lie, and figuring out how to prioritize the portfolio to really deliver against, quite varied preferences. And frankly, that's leading to an acceleration of some technologies, to John's point, that can accelerate on the ground practices with farmers in China, where they're ready for that. And then holding back a bit for North America, proving it out in different, countries, and then bringing it when the farmer's ready here. Or, knowing what it's going to take to get a particular, technology on the ground and start piloting with different farmers, and in this case, here in North America, to really get a foothold, get some, voice of the user out there, and then, use that to extend it. So I think there's this marriage of, what technology is ready with what the market is ready for, and how do you, really prioritize against that in creative ways.
Right. All right. And Nick, I'm going to give you just a little bit of the last word. How do you think about, as you think about your vision for moving to a plant-based food system, can you tell us a little more about the time? How long do you think that'll take, and how long do you think that'll take in the developed countries versus developing, and how do you put all that together?
Well, there's a lot of examples of where it takes a lot longer for the new technology to catch up to the incumbent. But once the technology catches up to the incumbent, it moves much faster than anyone can ever thought it could. And so I think we're starting to see this now. And so what's it going to take? It has to be products that deliver a better experience. So taste and food is number one. In any culture, any community, any type of food. Two, nutrition is becoming more important. People are caring more about that as a purchase driver. Affordability is huge, especially as you start getting into developing nations. And then you get to sustainability, which is really the core of impossible. But as products become more delicious, more affordable, more nutritious, and then obviously much, much more sustainable, it becomes a really easy consumer choice. And then the whole industry starts changing, because that's what consumers are demanding. Now, I think, for the innovation side and where it's going to go, if you look at the whole value chain, the right thing that we would grow in fields, say here, I'm in Hong Kong right now, so really throughout Asia versus Europe versus North America are probably different. And I think that's actually a really good thing. And so we've kind of, created systems that have scaled globally to a certain extent, but the right crops and the right systems for the right tastes are going to be different. So I think what we're going to see is more custom solutions within markets and that value chain. And then you move into the food production, which is really where we fit. And so we're making like a ground beef, ground pork, and we have a whole suite of products coming after this. And the ground beef is like, if you have a cow in the US versus a cow in Germany versus China, the cow's not that different. Yeah, you might have some Wagyu or Kobe that, the marbling's different, you feed them different things, but they're not that different from a product typically. Now, the way locally that now you take that product and you customize it to taste with spices, seasoning, the way you cook, there's tons of room for innovation there. And I think what we'll see is like, there's gonna be a lot of local innovations with companies saying is like, okay, we have this new ingredient effectively. Now, how can we actually create solutions for our constituents, our consumers that love this? And I think you're gonna see big innovation up front in the agricultural side that we tailor to the right growing seasons and the right crops for that area. In the product perspective, our approach is we're going to create products that can be customized wherever they go. Just like, beef and pork are customized really with any cuisine. Then you can essentially enable all the local companies and local entrepreneurs to, create different solutions, whether it's a restaurant or retailers or even, different applications like, dumplings, meatballs, pies, and stuff like that. And there's so much room for innovation across this entire field. The really hard part is, and what people don't focus on a lot, is that upstream side of the agriculture and ingredients, because those take a long time to scale. And for us, when we thought about this and moving fast, is we had research from the start on brand new ingredients, not even new to the system, but not scaled. And if we wanted to scale that to be able to commercialize a product, it would have taken us a lot longer, where we had to kind of pull back and say, what is available now to a certain extent and try to simplify as much as possible. As a lot of people on this call are talking about changing the systems, which is going to come over time, but that's going to move a lot faster than we ever thought it could.
That's great. Well, I've got a million more questions, but I'm watching my clock, and I know that that our time is about out. So I think we talked a lot about innovation on this discussion. We've talked a lot about looking to the future preferences of consumers, and particularly as they think about sustainability, thinking a lot about the capital to fund this journey along the way. So you've given us a lot to think about. So I'd like to just thank our panelists very much for your comments and your thoughts here. And I'll just add a couple of final notes. We're going to continue these discussions on financing the sustainable transition with our next discussion on May 19th will be about the infrastructure transition. So a very different area, but one that is also requires capital and transition. And as a really final note, we'd encourage anyone who's on the call and has tuned in to ask us about the research we've done, focus on the work that we have put in this area, share research with us. We like to collaborate across organizations and highlight others' great research. So, our website, fcltglobal.org. So let me just finally end by just saying thank you. Thank you, Audrey, Martin, Hen, Nick, John. Really terrific perspectives across the investment value chain. You've made me more excited about the opportunities in this space, as well as a greater understanding of the size of the challenge in front of us. So thank you all very much for your time today.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you.